Though the conflict in Syria overshadowed this summit, leaders of the world's largest economies are still dealing with a global economy in crisis. I spoke with Portland State University economics professor Robin Hahnel about the possibilities for growth and stabilization.
What's happening is you're having what's basically called tax competition, where the companies simply go to wherever it is they can get the best deal. Now, that is exactly why this would be the right place, someplace like the G20, for all the country governments that are experiencing budget crises. Most of them are experiencing serious budget problems, and part of the problem is they're not collecting any corporate taxes anymore as a whole. Yes, they need to coordinate, and that was supposed to be one of the major sort of issues that was discussed. From what I hear, unfortunately, very little has been accomplished on that subject. And this is the right place for it to be addressed, but it doesn't look like we've moved very far.
Let's talk a little bit about Ben Bernanke and the fact that he's kind of been hinting at he may start tapering QE. What impact do you think that's going to have on countries, and what countries should be nervous, and what should countries be doing to prepare for it?
On the one hand, what's happening in the United States is that we actually, we have a housing bubble that is bubbling again. And driving the interest rate on mortgage loans up is actually probably a productive way to keep that from getting out of hand. On the other hand, it slows down economic growth, and with our sequestering and more sequestering in the future, it's going to discourage the recovery. What the rest of the world is worried about is the quantitative easing, which drove interest rates down in the United States, led to financial investment flowing out into the emerging market economies. The BRICS, China, et cetera, were essentially flooded with international investment because of the low interest rates here in the United States and Europe. Now when those interest rates are rising, that money starts to flow back the other way. So that will aggravate the slowdown in the emerging market economies. They're very concerned about that.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about the Eurozone, because it always seems to be the focus of the G20, not so much this time around. What does that say about the European footing, and are you surprised at that?
Well, I mean, the region of the global economy that's in most serious crisis is Europe. It's in crisis largely because they have responded, instead of responding with some degree of fiscal stimulus to overcome the recession that hit them, that was a global recession, they have done precisely the opposite. And there's really very little evidence to suggest that they're going to do otherwise. The kind of drastic austerity, fiscal austerity, and concern over budgets coming out of the UK and Germany has literally put the Eurozone into a situation where it's hard to imagine that it can stay together under present policies.
Well, let me ask you about China, because they're talking about implementing economic reforms. Where do you see that in the economic landscape, and how important will that be?
They're a major player. They have their own issues. They have their own, they have their own concerns. One of the things that they're concerned about is a kind of construction boom bubble, that was, similar to the housing bubble here in the United States. That's why they cut back on, they cut back on their loans. They essentially tightened up on their own domestic money supply to try and keep something like that from happening. The major issue here I don't think China has really been the focus of the summit. The focus of the summit should have been serious financial reform, and unfortunately, that's been the least discussed thing. The focus of the summit should have been doing something about corporate tax avoidance and the tax havens and the race to the bottom effect of corporations simply bidding, forcing countries to bid against one another for their investment. Those should have been the subjects that were seriously addressed, and I think the shame is that apparently they really weren't. That really we're getting same old coming out of this summit on economic issues, unfortunately.
It's economics professor Robin Hahnel joining us from Portland, Oregon earlier today. Now,